The smell of burnt flour and despair had become Zachary Murdock's only companion until the morning. An orc woman with flour-dusted hands stood in his doorway and asked if the job was still available. He had posted the notice 3 weeks ago on the mill town board. A simple card requesting a baker's assistant, wages modest but steady. And in those 21 days, he had received exactly 0 inquiries from the humans of Millhaven, and one now from a green-skinned woman whose tusks were small and whose dark eyes held the kind of exhaustion he recognized in his own mirror. Her name was Orla Whitestone, she told him, and she could bake anything he needed if he would simply give her the chance. Zachary was a broad man, stocky and wide through the shoulders from years of hauling sacks of grain and kneading dough in quantities that would break a lesser baker's arms, and his face was the kind that smiled easily despite the weight he carried, the kind of face that made customers feel welcome even when the bread was a day old and the shop was too quiet. He had been handsome once, his wife used to say, before the gray crept into his brown hair and the lines settled around his eyes. But now he was simply tired, the kind of tired that seeped into bones and made every morning feel like lifting stones. His wife had died 2 winters past, a fever that took her quickly and left him with a kitchen that echoed and a business that was drowning in debt he had hidden from everyone, even from her in those final days when he should have been honest. He looked at Orla Whitestone standing in the pre-dawn darkness outside his shop, her green skin almost gray in the dim light, her pointed ears visible beneath a simple kerchief, and he made a decision born of desperation and something else, something that might have been hope if he let himself name it. "Can you start today?" he asked, and her shoulders dropped with relief so profound he felt it in his own chest. "Yes," she said simply, and followed him into the bakery that had been slowly dying around him. The ovens were a disaster, he explained as he led her through the front room with its empty display cases and swept floors, through to the back where the heat and flour and exhausted dreams lived. 2 of the 3 ovens had cracked fireboxes that made the temperature unreliable. The third was sound but too small to handle the volume a bakery this size should produce, and he had been trying to manage all the baking himself while saving coins to pay for repairs he could not afford. He had been failing, he did not say aloud, but she would see it soon enough in the sparse inventory and the lack of customers who had learned not to come early, because there was rarely anything worth buying. "I can work with the small oven while you repair the others," Orla said, her voice low and careful, the voice of someone used to being refused. "If you show me where the supplies are kept, I will start now." He showed her the flour stores, the salt and yeast, the butter he purchased from the dairy at the edge of town, the honey and seeds and dried fruits he could barely afford anymore. He showed her the recipes his wife had written in careful script in a leather journal, recipes he had not been able to look at for months without his throat closing. He showed her the banneton baskets and the proofing cloths and the peel for the oven, and then he stepped back and let her work because he had no other choice, and because something in the way she touched the flour sack told him she knew what she was doing. Zachary turned to the broken ovens with his tools and his determination, and for the first time in months, the bakery filled with the sounds of 2 people working instead of 1 man drowning. She baked through the morning while he dismantled the damaged firebox of the first oven, his hands black with soot, and his mind focused on the intricate puzzle of broken bricks and failing mortar. The smell reached him gradually, the scent of bread rising and baking, the particular perfume of crust forming and interior softening, and it was so achingly familiar and so long absent that he had to stop working and press his forehead against the cool stone wall until he could breathe normally again. His wife used to bake in the early mornings, used to fill the shop with this exact smell, and the absence of it had been killing him in ways he had not let himself acknowledge. When he finally emerged from the oven cavity, filthy and sweating, Orla had produced 20 loaves of bread that were so perfectly formed and beautifully browned that he simply stared at them cooling on the racks. "I did not know what style you preferred," she said, and he heard uncertainty in her voice, the fear that she had done wrong. "So I made a variety. The round loaves are a basic wheat, good for sandwiches or toast. The longer ones have rosemary from the jar I found in your cupboard. The small rolls are enriched with butter and a touch of honey. They will sell well to families with children. And these darker loaves are a rye blend, the kind that keeps well and slices thin for workers' lunches." Zachary picked up one of the round loaves and broke it open, and the interior was perfect, the crumb even and tender, the kind of bread that made his trained eye recognize true skill. He tasted it and closed his eyes because it was better than anything he had produced in the last 6 months, better than most of what he had made even before grief made his hands clumsy. "This is extraordinary," he said, and meant it completely. "Where did you learn to bake like this?" Orla was washing her hands in the basin, her back to him, and her shoulders tensed at the question. "My mother taught me, and her mother taught her. In my village, I was the baker for 3 years after my mother's hands grew too stiff for the work. But the village was small and poor, and when the harvest failed last year, people stopped buying bread from an orc when they could bake flat cakes at home for less." "So you came to Millhaven," Zachary said, understanding the shape of it. "I came to Millhaven and tried to buy supplies from the miller, who refused me. I tried to rent a stall at the market, and was told no space was available, even though I could see empty stalls. I tried to find work at the inn, the tavern, the other bakery on East Street, and was turned away from all of them." She turned to face him then, her chin raised and her eyes direct. "I have been sleeping in the hayloft of an abandoned barn at the edge of town and stealing apples from the orchard because I had no money left for food. When I saw your notice, I waited 3 weeks to see if anyone else would take the job, because I assumed you would refuse me like everyone else. But no one took it, and I was desperate enough to try." Zachary felt anger stir in his chest, clean and sharp, anger at his neighbors and fellow merchants who would let a skilled baker starve rather than look past her green skin. He was not a man given to grand gestures or speeches, but he was a man who believed in fairness and competence, and Orla Whitestone had just produced bread that was worth 3 times what he could pay her. "The job is yours for as long as you want it," he said firmly. "The wages are 2 silvers a week to start, plus meals and a share of any profits above basic expenses. The room above the shop is empty. It was my wife's sewing room before she passed, and you can stay there instead of a hayloft if you are willing. And if anyone in this town gives you trouble for working here, you send them to me, and I will explain the situation in terms they understand." Her expression did something complicated, surprise and relief and suspicion all tangled together. "Why would you do this for me?" "Because you can bake and I need a baker, and because letting you sleep in a barn when I have an empty room would make me the kind of man I do not want to be," Zachary said simply. "Also, because in about 2 hours the morning customers will arrive, and I would very much like to have something worth selling for the first time in months." She studied him for a long moment, and he let her look because he had nothing to hide except the debt, and that was his burden to carry, not hers. Finally, she nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. "I accept your terms, Zachary Murdock," she said. "And I will bake bread that will bring customers back to this shop, until you have to turn them away at the door." It was a bold claim, perhaps an arrogant one, but when the morning customers did arrive and saw the display case full of beautiful bread for the first time in memory, they bought everything she had made and asked when there would be more. The coins in the till were a thin comfort against the size of his debt, but they were more than he had taken in weeks, and for the first time since his wife died, Zachary felt something other than the grinding weight of failure. Orla moved into the room above the shop that afternoon, carrying a single canvas bag that held everything she owned, and Zachary tried not to feel ashamed of how little that was. He helped her carry up a mattress from the storeroom and some blankets he had packed away, and she thanked him with the same careful dignity she brought to everything, as though expecting kindness to be snatched away at any moment. They fell into a routine over the following days that felt both strange and deeply right. Orla worked through the nights, her strong arms tireless as she kneaded and shaped and baked, and Zachary spent his days repairing the ovens and serving customers and trying not to watch her too obviously when she came downstairs smelling of flour and yeast. She was not tall as Orc women were rumored to be, barely taller than his own stocky height, but she moved with a grace that surprised him, and her hands were astonishingly gentle with the dough, coaxing it rather than forcing it. They talked while they worked, conversations that started practical and grew personal by inches. She told him about her village in the northern hills, about learning to bake in her mother's kitchen, about the recipes passed down through generations of Orc women who had fed their communities with pride and skill. He told her about inheriting the bakery from his father, about meeting his wife at the harvest festival when they were both 17, about the years of happiness before the sickness came and the loneliness after. He did not tell her about the debt, the ruinous loan he had taken from Silas Garrett, the wealthiest merchant in Millhaven, to pay for his wife's medicines and the funeral and the lean months after when he could barely function. He did not tell her that Garrett held a note for 50 gold royals, an impossible sum, due in full at year's end, and that failure to pay would mean Garrett could seize the bakery and everything in it. He did not tell her because it was his shame and his failure, and because she had enough burdens without carrying his, but she was saving him anyway without knowing it, one loaf at a time. The customers came back, drawn by word of mouth and the undeniable quality of the bread. Orla's loaves were works of art, each one perfect in structure and flavor, and she had a gift for variety that kept people returning to see what she had made. She baked olive and herb focaccia that sold out by mid-morning, dense fruit and nut loaves that the wealthy families bought for their dinner tables, simple wholesome wheat bread that workers purchased for their lunches, sweet rolls studded with dried cherries that children begged their parents to buy. The display cases that had been empty for months were full every morning, and the till that had held only copper pennies began to accumulate silver and even the occasional gold. Zachary watched her work with growing admiration and something deeper, something he tried to ignore because it felt like a betrayal of his wife's memory, and because Orla deserved better than his complicated mess of a life. But ignoring it became harder each day as he learned the small details of who she was. She hummed while she braided dough, wordless melodies that sounded like the songs his wife used to sing. She left him fresh rolls wrapped in cloth every morning with butter and jam, small kindnesses that made his throat tight. She laughed at his jokes, real laughter that crinkled the corners of her eyes and made her tusks show, and the sound was the best thing he had heard in years. He fell in love with her slowly, and then all at once, the way a man falls asleep and then wakes to find the sun already high in the sky. It happened on a morning in late autumn when the air had turned cold and the first frost had silver lined the windows. Zachary came downstairs to find Orla asleep at the work table, her cheek pillowed on her folded arms and flour dusting her dark hair, exhausted from another night of baking. The ovens were all roaring. He had finally repaired the last of them, and the shop was warm and smelled like heaven, and she had worked herself to collapse to fill them all. He stood watching her sleep and felt his heart crack open with the realization that he loved this orc woman who had wandered into his dying bakery and brought it back to life, who baked with skill and passion, who had asked for nothing but a chance and given him back everything he thought he had lost. He loved her, and it terrified him because he was going to lose the bakery in 2 months when Garrett called the debt due, and loving her meant she would be hurt by his failure. Zachary fetched a blanket and draped it gently over her shoulders, and when she stirred and blinked up at him with sleepy confusion, he smiled and told her to rest, that he would handle the morning customers. She protested, but he insisted, and finally she nodded and let him guide her upstairs to her room where she could sleep properly. He managed the morning rush alone, selling the bread she had made and deflecting compliments by telling customers the truth, that they should thank Orla Whitestone, whose skill was responsible for the bakery's revival. Some of the customers looked uncomfortable at the mention of an orc, but most simply nodded and took their bread and came back the next day, because good bread transcended prejudice in a way that arguments never could. When Orla came downstairs in the afternoon, rested and apologetic, Zachary was kneading dough for the evening baking, and she joined him at the table without comment, their hands working in companionable silence. They had done this before, worked side by side, but today felt different, charged with something unspoken, and when their fingers brushed reaching for the same flour dusting, the contact sent electricity up his arm. "Zachary," she said quietly, not looking at him, her hands still moving in the rhythm of the kneading. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer honestly." His heart sped because he knew what was coming, could feel it in the tension of her voice. "Ask. The bakery is doing well now. The customers are returning, the sales are strong, the ovens are repaired. But you look more worried each day, not less. You count the coins in the till every night and your face grows darker, and you stare at papers you hide when I enter the room." She paused in her kneading and turned to face him, her dark eyes serious and a little hurt. "If I have done something wrong, if my presence here is causing you trouble, I need you to tell me so I can leave before it grows worse." "No," Zachary said immediately, his voice rougher than he intended. "You have done nothing wrong. You have been perfect, Orla. You have saved this bakery and you have saved me, and I am grateful for you every single day." "Then what is wrong?" she pressed, and her voice was gentle but implacable. "Why do you look like a man awaiting execution when everything is finally going right?" He could have lied. He was good at lying, at pretending everything was fine, at shouldering burdens alone, because that was what he had always done. But he looked at Orla's face, at the genuine concern there, and the growing trust they had built over weeks of working side by side, and he found he could not lie to her. "I owe a debt," he said heavily, setting down his dough and wiping his hands on his apron because they were shaking. "A large debt to Silas Garrett, the merchant who owns half the businesses on this street. I borrowed 50 gold royals 2 years ago to pay for my wife's medicines and care, and the terms were that I would repay it in full by year's end or forfeit the bakery to him." Orla's expression did not change, but he saw her hands tighten on the dough. "How much have you repaid?" 13 royals, Zachary admitted, the shame of it burning in his chest. "I have been making payments when I can, but business was so poor before you came that some months I could barely afford flour and rent, let alone debt payments." Garrett has been patient because he knows the bakery is worth more than 50 royals if he takes possession of it, and he is a man who plays long games for profit. So you have 2 months to repay 37 royals or lose everything, Orla said, and it was not a question. Yes, Zachary confirmed. And even with the improved business, even with your bread bringing customers back, I do not know if we can earn enough to clear that debt. I have been saving every spare coin, but the ovens needed repairs. We need supplies. There are other expenses, and the math does not work in my favor. He expected her to be angry, to feel betrayed that he had hidden this from her, to announce she was leaving before she got dragged into his disaster. Instead, she was quiet for a long moment, her hands resuming their work on the dough, her face thoughtful. "When were you going to tell me?" she asked finally. "I do not know," Zachary admitted. "I did not want to burden you with my failures. You came here looking for work and safety, not to inherit someone else's debts and problems. I thought perhaps I could solve it myself, or at least delay the inevitable until after you had saved enough wages to move somewhere better." "That is the stupidest thing I have ever heard," Orla said bluntly, and he blinked at her in surprise. "Zachary Murdock, I have been baking every night in this shop for 6 weeks. I know exactly how much flour we go through, how many loaves we sell, what the customers pay. Did you think I could not do basic mathematics? I knew the business was improving, but not enough for whatever burden you were carrying. I just did not know the details." "I am sorry," he said, because he did not know what else to say. "I should have been honest from the beginning." "Yes, you should have," she agreed, and then her expression softened slightly. "But I understand why you were not. You are a man used to carrying everything alone, used to protecting others even at cost to yourself. Your wife was lucky to have you, and I am lucky to work with you, but Zachary, you need to learn that partnership means sharing the hard things as well as the good." Something in his chest loosened at her words, the knot of isolation he had been carrying for so long easing slightly. "What do you suggest?" "I suggest we treat this as what it is, a business problem that requires a business solution," Orla said, her voice taking on the practical tone she used when planning the day's baking. "We have 2 months to earn 37 royals. That is roughly 18 royals per month, or 4.5 royals per week. Currently, we are taking in approximately 2 royals per week after expenses, so we need to more than double our income." "That is impossible," Zachary said flatly. "We are already baking at capacity with 3 ovens. I cannot ask you to work more hours, you barely sleep as it is." "Then we do not bake more, we bake smarter," Orla countered. "We focus on the highest profit items. The sweet rolls and fruit loaves that sell to wealthy families bring in 3 times the coin of simple wheat loaves. The special occasion cakes and pastries that you used to make, before you stopped having the time or energy, those command premium prices. And we expand our customer base beyond Millhaven." Zachary stared at her. "How?" "The grain mill on the river road serves 3 other towns within a day's cart ride. The innkeeper at the Crossroads Tavern told me last week he wished he could buy better bread for his guests, instead of the dry bricks his cook produces. The factor at the lumber camp north of here mentioned his workers would pay well for decent food. We could establish wholesale accounts, regular deliveries, guaranteed income." She was warming to the idea now, her eyes bright with the kind of strategic thinking that had nothing to do with baking and everything to do with survival. "And we could do special orders, wedding cakes and festival breads and celebration pastries, the kind of work that brings in serious money." It was a good plan, a solid plan, the kind of plan that might actually work if they could execute it. Zachary felt hope stir in his chest, fragile and dangerous. That would require both of us working longer hours, he said carefully. It would require me to trust you as a full partner in this business, not just an employee. And it would require you to risk your time and effort on a venture that might still fail and leave you with nothing. Orla met his eyes steadily, and he saw determination there and something else, something that made his heart beat faster. I am willing to risk it if you are, but I have conditions. Name them. First, you make me a true partner, not just in words but in contract. If we save this bakery, I want my name on it alongside yours, and I want a legal share of the business. I have been working for wages and I am grateful for them, but if I am going to pour my heart into saving this place, I want to know it will be mine too. Her voice was firm, businesslike, but he heard the vulnerability underneath. I have spent my life baking bread for other people's tables and other people's profit. I want something that belongs to me. Done, Zachary said immediately, because it was more than fair and because the thought of her name beside his on the bakery sign made him happier than it should. What else? Second, you stop trying to carry everything alone. You tell me the truth about our finances, about our challenges, about everything that affects this business. We make decisions together and we face problems together. She paused. I cannot help you if you hide things from me, Zachary. Agreed, he said and meant it. Is there a third condition? She hesitated, and for the first time since the conversation began, she looked uncertain. The third is more personal. Tell me anyway. I need to know that you do not regret hiring me, Orla said quietly, her eyes dropping to the dough between her hands. I need to know that when people talk, and they will talk about you employing an orc, about you making her a partner, about you defying the unspoken rules of this town. I need to know you will not wake up one morning and wish you had chosen an easier path. Zachary moved around the table before he could think better of it, flour dusted and emotional and completely certain. He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and when she did not he took her hands in his, her green fingers strong and capable and dusted white with flour. Orla Whitestone, you walking into my bakery was the best thing that has happened to me in 2 years, he said, his voice low and absolutely sincere. You brought life back to this place and to me, and I would be a fool to regret that. I do not care what people say. I do not care if they disapprove. I care that you bake bread that makes people weep with joy, and that you laugh at my terrible jokes, and that you make this empty building feel like home again. Whatever happens with the debt, whatever happens with the bakery, I will never regret knowing you. Her eyes were bright when she looked up at him, and her fingers tightened on his. You are dangerously kind, Zachary Murdock. I am dangerously honest, he corrected gently. At least when I stop being an idiot who tries to shoulder everything alone. She laughed at that, the sound breaking the tension, and they stood there in the flour-dusted kitchen holding hands like fools until the timer chimed and reminded them there was bread in the oven that needed tending. They worked through the night together drafting their plan, and by dawn they had a strategy that was ambitious and exhausting and possibly insane. Zachary would handle the wholesale negotiations and the special orders while continuing to manage the shop front and the regular customers. Orla would focus on production, maximizing the use of all 3 ovens to produce both their standard loaves and the premium items that would bring in higher profits. They would work longer hours, push harder, and bet everything on the hope that skill and determination could overcome mathematics and time. The next morning, Zachary drafted a partnership contract on paper that trembled slightly in his hands, simple language that made Orla Whitestone a half-owner of Murdock's bakery, entitled to equal say in all business decisions, an equal share of all profits after the debt was cleared. He signed it and she signed it, and they asked the magistrate's clerk to witness and seal it. And when the man raised his eyebrows at the sight of an orc woman becoming a business owner, Zachary stared at him until he completed the paperwork without comment. Then they went to work in earnest. Zachary took a cart loaded with Orla's best bread to the Crossroads Tavern and convinced the innkeeper to place a standing order for 20 loaves 3 times a week at premium wholesale prices. He rode to the lumber camp and secured a contract to supply the workers with bread and meat pies, bulk orders that would require overnight baking, but paid in advance. He visited the factor at the grain mill and arranged to display samples of their premium loaves. And within a week, they had orders from 2 of the other towns for wedding cakes and festival breads. Orla worked magic in the kitchen, organizing the ovens with the precision of a general deploying troops, baking the standard loaves in efficient batches, while preparing the more complex pastries and cakes that would bring in the serious money. She experimented with new recipes, combining the techniques her mother had taught her with innovations of her own, and produced breads that people talked about in the market square. Her cinnamon and apple morning buns became so popular they had to limit purchases to 2 per customer. Her dark chocolate celebration cake became the preferred choice for wealthy families hosting parties. Her savory meat pies, flaky and rich and perfectly seasoned, sold out within an hour of coming from the oven. The money began to accumulate, slowly at first and then with increasing speed. 2 royals a week became 3, then 4, then 5 as their reputation spread and the orders multiplied. Zachary kept meticulous accounts, tracking every copper earned and every expense paid, and the numbers began to shift from impossible to merely daunting. They worked side by side through the autumn and into early winter, exhausted and determined and increasingly aware of each other in ways that had nothing to do with business. Zachary caught himself watching Orla when she concentrated on delicate pastry work. Her tongue caught between her teeth and her strong hands impossibly gentle. Orla found herself inventing excuses to brush past him in the narrow kitchen, to ask his opinion on recipes she could easily decide herself, to hear his warm laugh when she made dry observations about their customers. They did not speak of it, the growing thing between them, because there was no time and because it felt fragile and dangerous. But it was there in the way Zachary made sure Orla ate proper meals and rested when exhaustion made her hands shake. It was there in the way Orla left him small gifts, a special roll baked with his favorite herbs, a flower made from twisted dough that she set on his workspace to make him smile. It was there in the conversations that stretched long into the night, sharing stories and dreams and fears while bread rose in the warmth of the ovens. 6 weeks before the debt came due, Silas Garrett visited the bakery. He was a tall man, lean and elegant in expensive clothing, with gray hair and cold eyes that calculated profit in every interaction. He arrived at midday when the shop was full of customers, and he stood in the doorway watching the efficient chaos of a successful business with an expression that might have been approval or might have been predatory interest. Zachary saw him and felt his stomach drop, but he finished serving the customer at the counter before acknowledging Garrett's presence. The older man approached with a smile that did not reach his eyes. "Zachary Murdock, I heard rumors that your fortunes had improved, but I confess I did not believe them until I saw this with my own eyes," Garrett said smoothly. "Your bakery appears to be thriving. I am pleased to see my investment in you was not entirely wasted." "Your loan, you mean," Zachary corrected, keeping his voice level and professional. "And yes, business has improved significantly. I will have your payment at the end of the year as contracted." Garrett's smile sharpened. "Will you indeed?" That would be 37 royals if my records are correct, a substantial sum to accumulate in so short a time. I admit I am curious how you managed this turnaround. Hard work and good bread, Zachary said simply, and did not mention Orla because he could see the calculation in Garrett's eyes and did not trust it. But Garrett's gaze had already drifted past him to the kitchen doorway where Orla had appeared, alerted by the change in Zachary's tone. She stood watching the exchange with her arms crossed and her expression neutral, but Zachary saw the tension in her shoulders. "Ah," Garrett said softly. "The rumors mentioned you had hired an orc. I assumed it was temporary charity or perhaps desperation, but I see she is still here. Tell me, is she responsible for this improvement in quality? The bread I purchased this morning was quite excellent." "Orla Whitestone is my business partner," Zachary said firmly, "and yes, her skill is a significant part of our success." "Business partner," Garrett repeated, his tone suggesting the words were faintly distasteful. "How progressive of you, Zachary, and how potentially complicated." "I do not see how it is complicated," Zachary said, though warning bells were ringing in his mind. "Our partnership is legal and properly documented." "Oh, I am sure it is," Garrett agreed. "But you should be aware that the covenant on your loan includes certain clauses about material changes to the business structure. Bringing in a partner, particularly one who owns equity, could be considered a material change that triggers the acceleration clause." Ice flooded Zachary's veins. "What are you talking about?" "The contract you signed, Zachary, which I have here if you would like to review it." Garrett produced a folded document from his coat, with the air of a man revealing a winning card. Section 7, Paragraph 3 states that any material change to business ownership or structure allows the lender, that would be me, to call the entire loan due immediately rather than waiting for the contracted end date. Bringing in an equity partner certainly qualifies as a material change. Zachary felt the world tilt beneath him. He had signed that contract in grief and desperation, barely reading the dense legal language, trusting that Garrett was offering help rather than setting a trap. He had been a fool. "When did you make her a partner?" Garrett asked, his voice conversational and deadly. 6 weeks ago, Zachary admitted, because lying would only make things worse. "Then I am within my rights to call the loan due now today in full," Garrett said, and there was satisfaction in his voice that made Zachary's hands curl into fists. 37 gold royals, Zachary. Do you have them?" "You know I do not," Zachary said, his voice rough with anger and fear. "You know that is impossible." "Then the bakery belongs to me as of this moment per the terms of the contract," Garrett announced. "You have 1 week to vacate the premises and turn over all equipment, inventory, and customer contracts. I will be generous and allow you to keep your personal possessions, but the business itself is forfeit." "No," Orla said, her voice cutting through the shop like a blade, and both men turned to look at her. She moved forward until she stood beside Zachary, her presence solid and steady. "You will not take this bakery." Garrett raised an eyebrow. "I am afraid the law is quite clear, Miss Whitestone. The contract is valid and enforceable, and Zachary's failure to meet its terms means I can seize the collateral. Your partnership, however well-intentioned, has unfortunately triggered the very clause that seals your shared fate." "The partnership that has doubled the bakery's revenue and made it worth far more than your 50 royals," Orla countered. "Tell me, Mr. Garrett, what do you actually want?" "Because if you wanted a failed bakery that barely breaks even, you could have seized it months ago when Zachary was struggling alone. But you waited, you were patient, and now suddenly you appear when the business is thriving to invoke an obscure contract clause. So I ask again, what do you want?" Garrett studied her with new interest, and Zachary saw the merchant reassessing, seeing not just an orc woman but a sharp mind that understood negotiation. "You are perceptive, Miss Whitestone. Very well, I shall be direct. I want this bakery and the prime location it occupies. I plan to demolish it and build a mercantile center that will anchor a row of shops I am developing. The failing bakery was worth little, but the land it sits on is worth a great deal. However, I am not an unreasonable man. If you can pay me 60 royals, I will release the debt and sell you the property outright." 60, Zachary said in disbelief. "The loan was for 50. The loan was for 50, but the property value is 60, and that is my price for walking away," Garrett said calmly. "You have 1 week to produce the money or vacate. Those are your options." He left then, the contract on the counter like a declaration of war, and the customers who had been watching the exchange with varying degrees of discomfort quickly paid and hurried out until the shop was empty except for Zachary and Orla. Zachary picked up the contract with shaking hands and read the clause Garrett had cited, and the legal language was dense but clear. He had given Garrett the power to destroy him, and he had not even known it. "I am sorry," he said hoarsely, not looking at Orla because he could not bear to see disappointment in her eyes. "I should have read this more carefully. I should have known. You were right to want a partnership contract, you were right to protect yourself, and I have failed you completely." "Stop," Orla said firmly. "Stop apologizing and start thinking. We have 1 week to earn or borrow 60 royals. It is a ridiculous amount of money, but we have done ridiculous things before. Orla, we have been working ourselves to exhaustion for weeks, and we have saved perhaps 15 royals above basic expenses," Zachary said, despair making his voice flat. "There is no possible way to earn 60 royals in 1 week. Even if we sold every piece of equipment in the shop, we would not come close." "Then we borrow it," Orla said. "From whom? I have no family, no friends wealthy enough to loan that kind of money, and no bank will touch me with an existing defaulted loan," Zachary said bitterly. "Garrett knows this. He structured this trap perfectly." Orla was quiet for a moment, her face unreadable, and then she straightened her shoulders in the way she did when making a difficult decision. "I know someone who might loan us the money." Zachary looked at her in surprise. "Who?" "My mother's brother, my uncle, lives in the Orc settlement 2 days north of here. He is a successful trader and he has capital. I have not spoken to him in over a year, not since I left my village, but he knew me as a child and he might be willing to help." Her voice was careful, controlled, but he heard the uncertainty underneath. "It would mean going to him and asking for a favor I have no guarantee he will grant, and it would mean revealing that I have failed to make my own way. But it is the only option I can see. I cannot ask you to humiliate yourself by begging your family for money to solve my problems," Zachary protested. "You are not asking, I am offering," Orla said. "And it is not just your problem, Zachary. The bakery is half mine now, remember. If we lose it, I lose it too. This is my fight as much as yours." He wanted to argue, wanted to refuse, wanted to protect her from having to do this, but he looked at her face and saw the determination there and knew she would go whether he agreed or not. So instead he nodded and said the only thing he could. "Thank you," he said quietly. "If you are willing to try, then we try together. When do we leave?" "Now," Orla said. "We close the shop, we take the cart, and we ride through the night if we must. Every hour we waste is an hour closer to losing everything." They prepared quickly, leaving a sign on the bakery door apologizing to customers and promising to reopen soon, packing supplies and hitching the cart horse that Zachary used for deliveries. The journey to the Orc settlement was long and cold, the autumn air biting and the roads rough, but they rode through the afternoon and into the evening without stopping, trading off who held the reins when the other grew too tired. They talked as they traveled, conversation born of exhaustion and fear and the strange intimacy of shared crisis. Orla told him about her uncle, a stern man who had built a trading business from nothing and had strong opinions about work and worth. She told him about leaving her village, the shame of it, and the desperate hope that somewhere she would find a place that valued her skills more than her species. She told him about the months of rejection and hunger before she found his bakery, and the terror she had felt knocking on his door that morning expecting another refusal. Zachary told her about his wife, the whole truth this time, not just the happy memories but the end, the slow decline and the helpless rage of watching someone he loved fade and being unable to stop it. He told her about the debt, about borrowing money he could not afford because he would have paid any price for one more day, one more chance, and about the crushing guilt when she died anyway and left him with nothing but bills and emptiness. He told her about the months after, the fog of grief that made every day feel like drowning, and about seeing her in his doorway and feeling something other than despair for the first time in memory. "I fell in love with you," he said quietly as the cart rolled through the darkness, the words escaping before he could stop them. "Somewhere between the first loaves you baked and the moment you demanded to know the truth about the debt, I fell in love with you, Orla Whitestone, and I am terrified that my failures will destroy you the way they destroyed my wife." The cart wheels creaked in the silence that followed, and Zachary cursed himself for speaking, for making this harder, for burdening her with feelings she did not ask for. But then Orla's hand found his on the reins, her fingers threading through his, warm and solid and real. "Your failures did not destroy your wife, Zachary," she said gently. "Sickness destroyed her, and there was nothing you could have done differently that would have changed that. You loved her and you tried to save her and you carried the cost of that trying alone, and none of that is failure. It is human and it is painful, but it is not failure." "I am going to lose the bakery," he said, the fear finally spoken aloud. "Even if your uncle loans us the money, even if we pay Garrett, we will be starting over with nothing, in debt again, and I cannot ask you to tie yourself to that kind of disaster." "You did not ask, I chose," Orla corrected. "And I fell in love with you too, you stubborn, generous, flower-dusted fool. I fell in love with the way you make customers feel welcome and the way you repaired ovens with your own hands and the way you looked at my bread like it was art instead of commerce. I fell in love with the man who gave me a chance when no one else would and who makes terrible jokes while kneading dough and who cares more about others than himself to the point of idiocy." She squeezed his hand. "So if we lose the bakery, we lose it together and we build something new together. And if we save it together. But either way, Zachary Murdock, you are stuck with me." He laughed, the sound ragged and relieved and utterly genuine, and brought her hand to his lips to kiss her flour-stained knuckles because he could not find words adequate for what he felt. They rode on through the night, two people in a cart heading toward an uncertain future, and for the first time since Garrett's visit, Zachary felt something like hope. They reached the Orc settlement at dawn, a collection of sturdy buildings built into the hillside with smoke rising from chimneys and the sound of early morning activity echoing across the valley. It was larger than Zachary expected, more prosperous, with cultivated fields and livestock pens and workshops that spoke of a thriving community. Orla's uncle, Orla Whitestone, operated a trading house from a building at the center of the settlement, a large structure with wagons outside and the organized chaos of a successful business inside. He was a broad-shouldered orc man with gray streaking his dark hair and the same sharp eyes that Orla had, and when he saw his niece standing in his doorway, his expression cycled through surprise and pleasure before settling on wary concern. "Orla," he said, his voice deep and carefully neutral. "It has been a long time." "It has, Uncle," Orla agreed. "I am sorry for that, and I am sorry to come to you now asking for help, but I am desperate and you are my only option." Thuron listened as she explained the situation, the bakery and the partnership and the debt and Garrett's trap, and Zachary watched the older orc's face for some sign of reaction. When Orla finished, Thuron was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming on the desk between them. "You want me to loan you 60 royals to save a bakery owned by a human in a town that refused to sell you flour," Thuron said finally. "That is what you are asking." "Yes," Orla said simply. "And what makes you think this business is worth saving? What makes you think this human will not squander the money the way he squandered his first loan?" Thuron's gaze shifted to Zachary, assessing and skeptical. Zachary met his eyes steadily, too tired and too honest to dissemble. "I cannot promise I will not fail, Mr. Whitestone. I failed before, I made bad choices, and I nearly lost everything. But I can promise that if you loan us this money, I will spend the rest of my life working to repay it and to prove worthy of the chance. And I can promise that your niece is the most skilled baker I have ever known, and if she believes this business is worth saving, then it is." "You love her," Thuron observed, and it was not a question. "Yes," Zachary confirmed, because there was no point denying it. "And you, Orla?" Thuron asked. "Do you love this human baker who comes to me asking for money he cannot repay?" "Yes," Orla said, her voice steady and clear. "I love him, and I believe in the bakery we are building together, and I am asking you to believe in us too." Thuron leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable, and the silence stretched until Zachary's nerves were screaming. Finally, the older orc nodded once, a sharp, decisive motion. "I will loan you 70 royals," he said, and Zachary's breath caught in his chest. 60 for the debt and 10 for operating capital, because you will need it. The terms are 5% interest annually, repayable over 3 years, with the bakery and all equipment as collateral. If you default, I own the business and you owe me nothing further. If you succeed, you repay me in full and we are square." It was more than generous. It was a lifeline thrown to drowning people, and Zachary felt his eyes sting with gratitude. "Thank you, Mr. Whitestone. We will not fail you." "See that you do not," Thuron said gruffly, and then his expression softened slightly as he looked at his niece. "Orla, your mother would be proud of you. You have built something real and you have found someone who values you as you deserve. Do not let anyone, human or orc, tell you otherwise." Orla's composure cracked, and she crossed the room to embrace her uncle, murmuring thanks and promises in their own language that Zachary did not understand, but felt the weight of. Thuron counted out the royals from his strongbox, stacking the gold coins in neat piles, and prepared the loan documents with the efficiency of a man who knew his business. They left the settlement with 70 royals in a locked box and a contract that gave them 3 years to make good, and the ride back to Millhaven felt like flying, like escaping a trap that had almost snapped shut. They stopped only once, at a quiet stream where they let the horse drink, and Zachary pulled Orla into his arms and kissed her properly for the first time, tasting flour and hope, and the future they were going to build together. "We are going to make this work," he promised against her lips. "We are going to pay your uncle back, and we are going to build the best bakery in 3 counties, and we are going to be happy." "Yes," Orla agreed, kissing him again, fierce and joyful. "We are." They reached Millhaven 3 days before Garrett's deadline, exhausted and filthy and triumphant, and Zachary sent word to the merchant that they had his money, and to meet them at the magistrate's office to settle accounts. Garrett arrived looking annoyed, clearly expecting them to have failed, and his expression soured further when Zachary counted out 60 gold royals onto the magistrate's desk. "The loan is repaid in full," Zachary said formally, with the magistrate as witness. "I want the contract marked satisfied and a deed for the bakery property transferred to myself and Orla Whitestone as equal partners." Garrett's jaw tightened, but he could not refuse in front of the magistrate, not when the money was sitting right there, and the law was clear. The paperwork was completed with ill grace, the coins were transferred, and within an hour Zachary and Orla walked out of the office with a deed in both their names and no debt, except the fair loan from her uncle. They reopened the bakery the next morning with a sign freshly painted to read "Murdock and Whitestone Bakers" in letters visible from the street, and the customers came flooding back, delighted to have their bread source restored. Word had spread about the confrontation with Garrett, about the orc woman and the human man who had fought to save their business, and public opinion had shifted in their favor in the strange way that small towns sometimes rally behind unlikely heroes. The weeks that followed were a blur of baking and selling and planning, of long nights working side by side and longer conversations about the future. They worked to build their customer base further, to establish the wholesale contracts more firmly, to create a business that was not just surviving but thriving. The debt to Thuron hung over them, but it was a manageable weight, a fair challenge rather than an impossible burden. They decided to expand, to hire additional help so Orla did not have to work every night, and Zachary could focus on the growing special orders business. They hired 2 assistants, a young human woman who wanted to learn baking and an orc man from the settlement who needed work, and the bakery became a place where species mixed without remark, where skill mattered more than skin color. Winter arrived in full force, and with it came the Midwinter Festival, the largest celebration in Millhaven's calendar, and an opportunity for bakers to showcase their finest work. Zachary and Orla spent weeks preparing, designing an elaborate display that would feature their best breads, their most impressive cakes, their most innovative pastries. The competition was traditionally dominated by the East Street Bakery, a large establishment that had been in business for generations. But this year, Murdock and Whitestone was determined to make a showing. They worked through the night before the festival, baking and decorating and arranging, and when dawn came their stall was a work of art. Towers of bread braided and twisted into intricate patterns, cakes decorated with spun sugar and candied flowers, pastries so delicate they looked like lace, and at the center, a massive festival bread shaped like the town's landmark mill, complete with a working sugar water wheel. The judges were town elders and merchants, including Silas Garrett, who scowled at their entry but could not deny its quality. The people of Millhaven crowded around the stall, marveling at the craftsmanship, and when the judges announced Murdock and Whitestone as the winners, the cheering was loud enough to echo across the square. It was more than a competition win. It was a validation, a public acknowledgement that the bakery was not just surviving but excelling, that an orc woman and a human man could build something worth celebrating. Orders flooded in after the festival, special commissions and wholesale contracts and requests from neighboring towns, and the business that had nearly died became stronger than it had ever been. On the first day of spring, 3 months after they paid off Garrett, Zachary woke before dawn as usual and came downstairs to find Orla already in the kitchen. But instead of baking, she was sitting at the work table with a small box in her hands. She looked up when he entered, and there was nervousness in her eyes and something else, something hopeful and terrified. "I have something for you," she said quietly. Zachary sat down across from her, his heart beating faster because he recognized the weight of the moment even if he did not understand it yet. "What is it?" Orla opened the box and showed him what was inside. A simple ring made of braided copper wire, the work of an amateur but made with clear care. In Orc culture, when a woman decides she wants to marry a man, she makes him a ring with her own hands and offers it to him. If he accepts it and wears it, they are betrothed. If he refuses, she moves on and they do not speak of it again. Zachary stared at the ring, at Orla's nervous face, and felt joy explode in his chest like sunrise. "You are asking me to marry you. I am asking you to marry me," Orla confirmed. "I know we have only known each other a few months. I know there are people who will disapprove. I know our lives will not be easy. But I love you, Zachary Murdock, and I want to build a life with you, not just a business. I want to wake up beside you every morning and bake bread with you every night and grow old with you in this bakery we saved together. So I am asking, will you marry me?" "Yes," Zachary said immediately, his voice rough with emotion. "Yes, Orla Whitestone, I will marry you, and I will wear this ring with more pride than any man has ever worn any piece of jewelry, and I will love you until the day I die and probably beyond." She slipped the copper ring onto his finger, and it fit perfectly, warm against his skin, and he pulled her into his arms and kissed her while the ovens heated, and the morning light crept through the windows, and the future opened up before them full of possibility. They were married a month later in a small ceremony at the magistrate's office, with her uncle Thuron and their bakery assistants as witnesses. And if some of the townsfolk muttered about mixed marriages and impropriety, many more came to the bakery afterward to offer congratulations and order celebration cakes. They spent their wedding night in the room above the shop, listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling and the ovens cooling, and it felt right, felt like home. The business continued to grow through the spring and summer, their reputation spreading until people traveled from distant towns, specifically to buy Murdock and Whitestone bread. They paid off the loan to Thuron 6 months early, the combination of skill and hard work and genuine partnership producing profits they had hardly dared to imagine. Thuron came to collect the final payment personally and stayed for dinner, and Zachary watched him and Orla talk and laugh, and felt grateful for the family he had gained along with the wife. On a warm evening in late summer, nearly a year after Orla had first walked into his bakery, Zachary stood in the shop after closing and looked at everything they had built. The ovens were all functioning perfectly. He had finally replaced the old one that had given them so much trouble. The shelves were stocked with supplies, inventory they could afford because the business was genuinely successful. The display cases were clean and ready for tomorrow's bread, beautiful cases he and Orla had purchased together to replace the worn ones he had inherited from his father. And on the wall behind the counter hung a sign, beautifully lettered, that read Murdock and Whitestone Bakers established this year purveyors of fine breads and pastries. Below it was a smaller sign that listed their specialties and their hours and their promise of quality. And below that was a framed copy of their partnership contract, a reminder of where they had started and how far they had come. Orla came to stand beside him, wiping her hands on her apron, her hair escaping from its kerchief and her face smudged with flour, and she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "Happy?" she asked, leaning against his shoulder. "Extraordinarily," Zachary confirmed, wrapping an arm around her waist. "Tired but happy. "You, the same," Orla said. "I never imagined this, you know. When I was sleeping in that barn and stealing apples, I never let myself imagine I could have this. A business with my name on it, a husband who loves me, a place where I belong. It seemed impossible." "Nothing is impossible when you have the right partner," Zachary said, kissing the top of her head. "You taught me that." They stood in the quiet bakery as the light faded outside, and Zachary thought about the year past, about loneliness and desperation, and the courage to ask for help, about an orc woman who had filled his heart instead of just his table, about falling in love and building something worth saving. He thought about the future, about the bakery they would continue to grow, about the possibility of children someday learning to bake in this same kitchen, about growing old with this woman who had saved him in every way that mattered. The next morning would bring new customers and new challenges, would bring bread to bake and orders to fill, and the ongoing work of running a successful business. But tonight, standing in the bakery with his wife, Zachary was simply grateful, grateful for second chances and good bread and the kind of love that transformed everything it touched. "We should go upstairs," Orla said eventually, practical as always. "We have to be up early to bake for the harvest festival orders." 5 more minutes, Zachary negotiated, not ready to leave this moment, this perfect peaceful feeling of rightness. Orla smiled and settled more firmly against him, and they stood together in the flour-dusted quiet while outside Millhaven prepared for sleep, and inside the ovens ticked as they cooled, and the building that had once felt like a tomb now felt like home. 3 years later, on a crisp autumn morning very much like the one when Orla had first arrived, Zachary stood in the same bakery holding a very different kind of future in his arms. Their daughter, barely 6 months old, blinked up at him with dark eyes that matched her mother's, and when she yawned her tiny mouth revealed the small buds that would someday be tusks. Her skin was a soft olive that blended both her parents' tones, and her ears came to gentle points beneath the fine dark hair that crowned her head. They had named her Vera, after Zachary's mother, and she was the most perfect thing either of them had ever created, more wonderful than any bread or pastry, more precious than any business success. Orla emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of fresh morning buns, their current bestseller, and she paused to smile at the sight of her husband and daughter. She was more confident now, moved through the bakery with the assurance of an owner rather than an employee. And if there were still occasional customers who objected to being served by an orc, they were vastly outnumbered by those who appreciated quality and kindness. The bakery employed 5 people now, a mix of humans and orcs, and produced enough bread daily to supply 3 towns and a dozen wholesale accounts. The building next door had come up for sale, and they had purchased it, expanding the bakery to include a larger kitchen and a proper cafe where customers could sit and enjoy fresh bread with coffee and butter and jam. The renovations had been completed last month, and the grand reopening had drawn crowds that stretched around the block. But this morning was quiet, the calm before the daily rush, and Zachary treasured these moments when it was just his family and the familiar smell of baking bread, and the knowledge that they had built something real and lasting. "She is going to want to eat soon," Orla observed, setting down the tray and coming to collect her daughter. "And you need to finish setting up the display cases before we open." I know," Zachary said, but he stole another minute holding Vera, memorizing the weight of her and the perfect trust in her eyes. Finally, he handed her to Orla and watched his wife settle in the corner to nurse while he returned to the work of preparing for the day. The morning rush came as it always did, a flood of regular customers and new faces, people wanting bread for their families and their tables and their celebrations. Zachary served them with the same warmth he had always brought to the work, and he watched Orla move through the bakery managing staff and greeting customers and making everything run smoothly, and he felt the deep satisfaction of a life well lived. At mid-morning, Thuron arrived with a wagon full of supplies, part of the regular delivery route he had established to serve the bakery and other businesses in the region. He stayed for coffee and to play with his great niece, and the three adults talked about business and family, and the upcoming harvest festival, while Vera gurgled happily on her grandfather's knee. "You have built something remarkable here," Thuron said, looking around the busy bakery with obvious pride. "Your mother would be proud, Orla. Both of your mothers would be," he added, nodding to Zachary. "We built it together," Orla corrected gently, her hand finding Zachary's across the table. "That is the only reason it worked." Later, after Thuron left and the lunch rush subsided and Vera went down for her nap in the apartment upstairs, Zachary and Orla stood together in the expanded kitchen watching their staff work. The ovens were all roaring, producing batch after batch of the breads that had become their trademark, and the air was thick with heat and the incomparable smell of baking. "Do you remember the first morning?" Zachary asked quietly. "When you showed up asking for the job, and I was so desperate I said yes without even asking for references. I remember thinking you were either very kind or very foolish," Orla said with a smile. "I am still not entirely sure which it was." "Both, probably," Zachary admitted. "But I am grateful for it every day. For saying yes, for taking a chance, for letting you fill my heart instead of just my table." "That is almost poetic," Orla teased. "Are you going soft in your old age, Zachary Murdock?" "Zachary Whitestone Murdock," he corrected, because they had both legally changed their names when they married, a blending of identities that matched the blending of their lives. "And yes, absolutely. Fatherhood has made me sentimental." The afternoon stretched toward evening, and they worked side by side as they always had, partners in every sense. And when the day finally ended and the last customer departed and the staff went home, they locked the doors and climbed the stairs to their apartment where their daughter waited. They ate dinner together, a simple meal of bread and cheese and soup, and they talked about the day and the week ahead and the thousand small details that made up a shared life. They gave Vera her bath and put her to bed, singing the old orc lullabies that Orla's mother had sung to her, and then they sat together in the quiet apartment listening to the building settle. "I love you," Zachary said, because he said it every day and never grew tired of the words. "I love you too," Orla replied, because she felt the same. Outside, Millhaven slept, and in the bakery below the ovens cooled and the dough for tomorrow's bread rose slowly in the warmth, and everything was exactly as it should be. A lonely man had asked an orc girl to bake bread, and she had filled his heart instead of his table, and together they had built a life that was richer and fuller and happier than either had dared to dream. The story that had started with desperation and a want ad had become a love story, a business success, and a family. And if there were still challenges ahead, still prejudices to overcome and problems to solve, Zachary and Orla would face them the same way they had faced everything else since that first morning when flour-dusted hope walked through the bakery door. Together, on the morning of the harvest festival, 5 years after that first meeting, Murdock and Whitestone Bakers opened its doors to a line of customers that stretched 3 blocks, all waiting to purchase the breads and pastries that had become legendary in the region. The festival display was even more elaborate than the one that had won them their first competition, a collaborative effort involving all their staff and featuring breads from both human and orc traditions, a celebration of the blending that the bakery itself represented. Zachary and Orla worked the festival stall together, their daughter Vera playing nearby under the watchful eye of her uncle's family, who had come from the Orc settlement for the celebration. Their son Marcus, 2 years old and already showing signs of his father's stocky build, toddled between his parents demanding tastes of everything they sold. The children were happy and healthy, accepted by most of Millhaven's residents as the new normal, proof that different peoples could build families and futures together. The day was long and exhausting and wonderful, filled with sales and compliments, and the satisfaction of seeing their work appreciated. When the judges announced the winners in various categories, Murdock and Whitestone took first place in 3 of them, including the overall Best Bakery Award that came with a ribbon and a small purse of prize money. But the real victory was not the awards or the sales or the recognition, though all of those were gratifying. The real victory was standing at the festival stall with Orla's hand in his and their children playing nearby, and the ovens waiting at home ready for another day's work, and knowing that the lonely man he had been was gone, replaced by someone who had found love and purpose and partnership in the most unexpected place. That evening, after the festival closed and they packed up the stall and returned to the bakery, Zachary and Orla stood on the street looking up at their sign. Someone had hung bunting from it earlier, decorations for the festival, and the colored flags snapped in the autumn breeze above the words that proclaimed their names and their trade. "Ready for tomorrow?" Orla asked, because tomorrow would bring new orders, new customers, new bread to bake. "Always," Zachary said, squeezing her hand. "As long as you are with me." They went inside together, to the bakery that had saved them both, to the ovens that had witnessed their love story, to the future they were still baking one loaf at a time. The door closed behind them, and the lights in the windows glowed warm against the gathering darkness, and Millhaven settled in for another night knowing that come morning there would be fresh bread waiting, baked by the woman and man who had proven that the best things in life come from taking chances on unlikely partnerships. And if sometimes, late at night when the bakery was quiet and the children were asleep, Zachary would stand in the kitchen and remember that first morning when a green-skinned woman had asked for a job, he would smile and send a silent thank you to whatever luck or fate or desperate hope had made him say yes. Because Orla Whitestone had walked into his bakery looking to fill his table, and instead she had filled his heart, his life, his future, and every corner of the empty building that had become a home. She had given him partnership and love and children and purpose, had given him reasons to wake up and work hard and believe in tomorrow. And in return, he had given her the same, a place to belong and a business to build and a family to love. And together they had created something that was more than the sum of its parts, something that would outlast them both and feed generations to come. The bread would rise again tomorrow, as it rose every day, patient and reliable and nourishing. And Zachary and Orla would rise with it, partners and lovers and friends, baking their way through whatever challenges came, secure in the knowledge that together they could handle anything life served them. It was a good life, a happy life, built on flour and determination and love, and it had all started with a simple question and a brave answer on a morning that had promised nothing but continued loneliness. Instead, it had delivered everything.